Good evening. This is Weekdays with Wendy, and today marks the 100th year since the Tulsa Massacre. It began the night of May 31st and continued into the hours on June 1st, 1921. 35 to 40 blocks of a thriving African-American neighborhood in Tulsa, the Greenwood District, was destroyed, demolished, burned to the ground. Hundreds lost their lives, although because records were destroyed, we don't have an accurate count. People were discarded in rivers, in different grave sites, and they're continuing to try to find these people who were lost following the destruction and violence of those hours. To add insult to injury, the Tulsa City Council tried to pass laws and statutes to prevent the African Americans from rebuilding in that area. And to continue the insult, there was an unwritten decision to not talk about it. And so for decades, people growing up in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, didn't hear about the massacre because it wasn't being taught, it wasn't being talked about. There was silence. And it wasn't until the Oklahoma bombing, where people talked about this first domestic terrorism event on Oklahoma soil, that people responded, well, this isn't the first, that the real story started to come out more and more. It saddens me to the core that the state that I wasn't born here, but I've come to love this as my home. I love the people in Oklahoma. But like you, I'm ashamed of that element of our past, that people could be so brutal, so violent, so hate-filled as to destroy others. It's interesting because today's reading of the Love Your Neighbor, No Exceptions daily calendar talks about being a neighbor. And the people who lived and worked in Greenwood were attacked by their neighbors. Today's reading comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you shall live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Well, you know that Jesus didn't answer his question directly, but instead told him the story of the Good Samaritan, that a man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho and was attacked by robbers, and a priest saw him and crossed to the other side of the road and passed by. A Levite, someone who worked in the temple along with the priests, saw him and crossed to the other side of the road and passed by. But then a Samaritan, who because of their long history really was seen as an adversary, an enemy to the Jewish people. It was a Samaritan who saw the man and stopped and took care and took care of him and bandaged his wounds, took him to an inn where he could be cared for. And then Jesus asked the lawyer, so which of these proved to be a neighbor to the man? And the lawyer said, the one who showed mercy. And Jesus said, you have answered correctly. Do this and you shall live. The one who showed mercy. What is a neighbor? It's not defined by the proximity, how far you live from someone. A neighbor is how you treat someone. And one of the things that Jesus lifts up as the greatest commandment is this two-part sentence, which really can be summed up: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. If you do that, the second part of it's included, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus defines being a neighbor as showing mercy, having mercy on those people who are in need. When you come across someone, you live as a neighbor to them. And it flows out of our love for God. We are called to love our neighbors, no exceptions. I can't go back and change what happened 100 years ago. I can't undo all the injustices that have transpired since, but what I can do is make sure that, at least for my family, the silence ends with me. I'll make sure that my children and my children's children and so on know about the Tulsa massacre. Not because it's fun to recount such a tragic, horrific story, but because knowing the truth helps us to learn and grow and change, especially where change is needed. I'm going to make sure, at least for my family, that there's no more ignorance. We are called to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And it's really pretty simple. If you wouldn't want it done to you, don't do it to somebody else. Treat your neighbors the way you would want to be treated. And let the silence and the ignorance and the emptiness of history in the Tulsa massacre end with this generation. Let's make sure that it's known so that we can make sure change happens. Have a good evening.